we have carried out this study with others in Sheffield who I'll mention in a minute. Why did I choose this particular piece of work as what I knew would be the last major piece of empirical research that I would do? I hope to write some theory in the future, but I'm certainly not going to take on another big research project and all the hassle of research grants and research assistants and all that. Thanks very much. So why did I decide to take on this as my final empirical research project? Answer: because essentially I had become very interested in theories of compliance, as some of you know, and of course desistance is centrally related to compliance. What I'll be saying in the next 40 minutes or so is in a way quite micro and quite detailed, and you might think in a way too detailed for an occasion of this kind, but I think and hope, but you will be the judge, that actually in what I'm going to say there are some broader themes, and so I want to make sure that we've got a bit of time at the end for questions to be raised, where perhaps you can raise in discussion some of the wider themes that emerge from some of the more detailed work that I will discuss with you. This graph has haunted me for the last 5 years. It is in one sense a criminological commonplace. We've all seen it any number of times. It is our old friend the age crime curve. But the age crime curve, of course, that's for males, that's for females. The spike is of course much sharper for males, but when you look at it, it's really a pretty remarkable shape, and of particular interest to anybody who's interested in compliance is this bit with the very sharp decrease in criminality in the 20s. So what's going on? Why is that happening? Well, one possible explanation is that it's a bit artifactual, really, and an explanation along those lines was put forward by Terry Moffat, an excellent psychological criminologist who works in London. As many of you will know, Terry Moffat proposed a theory whereby there was a so-called developmental taxonomy of offenders who were divided into two main types, the adolescence limited and the life course persistent. The theory was and is that adolescence limited offenders are people who commit a few offences in adolescence, and that's all, whereas life course persistent offenders start much earlier and continue much later. And the graph, the age crime curve graph, is actually a cross-sectional graph. That is to say, the one I showed you before is a cross-sectional graph. That is to say, it is simply a bar chart of people who were convicted or cautioned in England and Wales in the year 2000. So it's a cross-section of all the official offenders. So if you've got a cross-section of that kind, then it is theoretically possible that you've got two different kinds of people like this, in which case this big drop here would perhaps not be so interesting, because all it would mean was that you've got a lot of adolescence limited offenders. On the other hand, Sampson and Laub, a couple of celebrated American criminologists who rather fortunately discovered in the basement of Harvard Law Library a load of boxes. Sometime in the 80s they discovered a load of boxes containing the data of the Gluck's celebrated study of young offenders. Following these young offenders, this goes back to the 1950s. By the time they found the boxes, the Glucks were both dead. So they decided to recode the data using modern data processing techniques, and they wrote a very interesting study, of which more later. And amongst other things, they were able to follow up the Gluck's sample, which was a sample of persistent adolescent offenders with a peak age of crime of 15, and they followed them up until age 70. So this is not a cross-sectional age crime curve. This is a longitudinal age crime curve of a bunch of persistent adolescent offenders. As you can see, it follows exactly the same shape as the cross-sectional curve, beginning to suggest that maybe that drop in the 20s isn't just an artifact of adolescence limited offenders, but that something else might be going on. And then it's very complicated, but the basic idea is that there's a whole lot of things here. This is going across in terms of age. A whole lot of things here are happening in adolescence. Doesn't matter about those. And you finish up with delinquency. Okay? But then they postulated that delinquency does not necessarily continue, and that in adulthood social bonds, in particular weak labour force attachment and weak marital attachment, or of course strong and strong, would help to determine whether you continued or not. In particular, if you had a strong marital attachment and or a strong labour force attachment, remembering that we're talking about the 1950s now, if you had either of those, then this would help to mean that you might desist, even although you had a pretty awful background back here. In other words, what was going on here, they postulated, was independent or partially independent of what had gone on in the earlier period. Now, if that is correct, then Moffat's simple twofold thing does not work, because this assumes that some people are so damaged by their early childhood experiences that they become life course persistent offenders, and maybe you can do a little bit about that, but not a lot. Whereas the bulk of this curve is created by the adolescence limited group. So we have two conflicting theories which are both highly related to the familiar age crime curve. In the Sheffield study, to give you the headline first, our results strongly suggest that Sampson and Laub have more going for them in terms of our sample, at least, than does Moffat's theory. But life is actually rather more complicated than the Sampson-Laub theory would suggest. So let's have a look then at the Sheffield Desistance study, which, as you can see, was funded by the ESRC as part of the so-called SCOPIC research network led from Cambridge by my colleague Per-Olof Wikström. The Sheffield Desistance study, as its name implies, was carried out at the University of Sheffield, principally by myself and Joanna Shapland, but with some very good